No tail flick, no color change, no micro-expression shift, no chemical signal detectable by Vex secondary olfactory system. She simply sat there, hands folded, face as neutral as deep space. It was, he realized with small, unwelcome ripple of discomfort, unsettling. Every species he had ever negotiated with had tells. The Vin changed color along their dorsal surfaces when agitated. The Scoth released faint pheromone bursts when frightened. Even the stoic granite folk, whose emotions were as difficult to read as tectonic shifts, showed microscopic crystalline reconfigurations when stressed. This human was showing him nothing. Absolutely nothing. "Let me provide some context," Vex said, forcing his voice back into the lower registers of authority, leaning forward until his shadow stretched the full length of the table. "The craft Dominion has conquered 47 star systems. 47. We have subjugated civilizations that have been sailing the stars for 1,000 years before your ancestors worked out what fire was for. Our military has breached siege lines that stood for decades. Our soldiers trained from birth in combat disciplines that your species hasn't even named yet." He extended one talon slowly, deliberately, making sure she got a clear view of the serrated edge. "You are built like prey, Captain Torres. Soft skin that offers no meaningful resistance to impact or penetration. No natural weapons. No armor. A body temperature regulation system so fragile that you require mechanical climate control simply to remain functional. I mean no personal disrespect when I tell you this. It is simply biological fact. You are not built for this conversation." Elena waited, as though he might have more to add. "Are you finished?" she asked. The audacity of it hit him like a physical impact. His secondary stomach clenched. "Finished." The laugh this time was shorter, sharper, closer to a snarl. "I have barely introduced myself. Captain Kepler. 7 sits atop the largest verified beryllium deposit in this entire sector, a mineral reserve worth more than every financial instrument your civilization has produced in its entire history. You genuinely believe that 3,000 soft-body colonists are going to prevent the craft military from taking what we have already decided is ours?" He spread his arms wide, gesturing at her with expansive, mocking generosity. "Please, help me understand the strategy. I am genuinely curious." Elena looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted almost imperceptibly behind her eyes. Not fear, not anger. Something else. Something he couldn't immediately classify. "We have stood against worse," she said quietly. He almost choked. "Worse." He repeated the word as though testing its structural integrity. "Worse than what?" "When has your species ever faced a military power of the craft's caliber? You have been at peace for nearly a century. You negotiate with language and sign agreements," and he let the contempt drip into his tone. "Handshakes. The craft negotiate with orbital bombardment platforms and breach infantry. Your civilization has gone soft from comfort and diplomatic habit. It is not an insult. It is simply the natural consequence of choosing peace for too long. Ambassador Vex." Her voice had changed. Barely. Almost nothing. A drop in register. A slight flattening of tone. The way a sky changes color just before weather arrives. "I would strongly encourage you to reconsider your position before this conversation progresses further. We do not want conflict. I want to be clear about that. But if you force our hand, the craft Dominion will come to regret it." Vex leaned back and laughed for a long time. 20 seconds, at least. Perhaps 30. He couldn't help it. The image was simply too perfect. This diminutive creature. See it across from him with her ancient uniform and her 2 eyes and her soft hands, issuing a warning to Vex Thornax, who had personally led 17 planetary invasion campaigns, and whose name had been used to frighten hatchlings in craft war creches for 2 generations. "Regret it," he finally managed, wiping moisture from his secondary eyes. "The human is threatening me." He leaned in close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his scales, close enough to eliminate any comfortable distance between them. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous rumble. "What exactly is your plan, Captain Torres? Negotiate me into submission? File a formal grievance with the Galactic Council? Send a strongly worded memorandum? Maybe," he spread his claws in theatrical invitation, "you could wave that little hand at me again." Elena Torres stood up, slowly, very, very slowly, with the kind of deliberate, measured control that Vex would later recognize as its own kind of warning, if only he'd been paying different attention. "I think," she said softly, "it is time for a history lesson." Something in the room changed. The temperature didn't move. The lighting stayed constant. No physical variable shifted that Vex instruments could detect. And yet every instinct he possessed, every threat assessment system that 10,000 generations of warrior evolution had built into his nervous system, fired simultaneously, sending a single unanimous message up through his spine. "Pay attention." Elena walked around the table slowly, her footsteps quiet and precisely placed, and Vex tracked her with all four eyes. He noticed, with professional's unease, that he had lost clear visual on both her hands. "Tell me, Ambassador," she said, her voice now carrying a quality it hadn't held before, not loudness, not aggression, but weight, the kind of weight that belongs to things that have been true for a long time. "What do you know about Earth?" "A garden world," he said, forcing the dismissal into his voice. "Temperate, resource-rich, the kind of comfortable environment that breeds species who rather negotiate than fight. A paradise, essentially." Elena smiled at that. The smile contained no warmth whatsoever. "Let me correct some fundamental misunderstandings," she said. She stopped moving, standing perhaps 3 meters from him, and something in her posture changed. A subtle redistribution of weight, a slight lowering of her center of gravity that his combat trained I recognized, even if his conscious mind was slow to admit why. "Earth has a 99.9% extinction rate. Do you understand what that number means? For every species alive on our planet at this moment, thousands of others failed to test before them. Our world does not nurture life, Ambassador Vex. It filters it, constantly, brutally, without sentiment or mercy. Every creature that currently exists on Earth is a descendant of an unbroken chain of survivors going back through mass extinctions, ice ages, asteroid impacts, and geological catastrophes that reshaped entire continents. Our world has been trying to kill everything on it since the day the first cell divided. Life on Earth didn't succeed by being comfortable. It succeeded by refusing to die." Vex shifted in his chair. He kept his expression controlled. "Many worlds have severe evolutionary pressures. I'm just getting started." The quiet cut him off more effectively than volume ever could. "Humans evolved as persistence predators, not the fastest species on our planet. Not the strongest, not the most heavily armed by any biological metric. But we can run, Ambassador Vex. We can run for days. Not sprinting, sustaining. Our prey species are faster than us, stronger than us, fiercer than us. So we learned to chase them. We would track an animal across deserts, over mountain ranges, through forests, hour after hour after hour, never stopping, never resting, maintaining a pace our prey couldn't sustain. We would run until their hearts exploded from the physiological strain of being endlessly, inexorably hunted. We called it persistence hunting, but what it really was, what it is an early expression of something that has defined our species ever since." She paused, letting the silence do the work. "We don't stop." Vex's scales rippled. The involuntary muscular contraction happened before he could suppress it, a biological admission. He immediately resented. "Primitive tactics," he managed. "Ancient history." "You're right." Elena agreed, and the agreement was more unsettling than argument would have been. "Let me bring it forward. Humans have been fighting wars for the entirety of our recorded history. 5,000 years of continuous, uninterrupted, sophisticated warfare. We have killed each other with rocks and sharpened bones, with spears and bronze blades, with black powder and steel, with machine guns and artillery barges, with poison gases that dissolved living lung tissue while soldiers were still breathing, with biological weapons engineered in sterile laboratories by people with advanced degrees, and with nuclear fire capable of vaporizing a city in the span of a single second." She began to pace again, and Vex's four eyes tracked her with increasing alertness. "A century ago, we fought a war we called the First World War. 20 million dead in 4 years. We sat in trenches filled with mud and corpse water and rats for months at a time, enduring artillery bombardments that never fully stopped, and we held our positions. When it ended, civilized observers said, 'Surely now humanity understands. Surely this horror is sufficient. We held conferences. We signed treaties. We built institutions designed to make it impossible for such a thing to happen again. She stopped pacing. 20 years later, we did it again. The silence was absolute. The Second World War. 85 million dead. We firebombed cities, erasing them overnight with storms of incendiary ordnance. We built industrial complexes whose sole design purpose was the systematic murder of millions of people in the most administratively efficient manner possible. Warehoused, cataloged, processed. We developed a weapon that could atomize 100,000 people in a single flash of light, lasting less than a millisecond. And when we had it, Ambassador Vex, when we held in our hands the most destructive tool any species had ever created, we used it. Twice. Vex's mouth had gone completely dry. His translator was still faithfully converting her words. But some part of his brain was having difficulty processing the numbers. Not because they were unimaginable. He had studied warfare all his life. But because she was describing a species doing this to itself, to its own members. People who shared genetics, language, history, culture. After that, Elena continued, her voice carrying the flat, matter-of-fact quality of someone reciting established fact. We spent approximately 40 years pointing enough nuclear weapons at ourselves to sterilize the entire planet 20 times over. 20 times, Ambassador. Not once. Not we could end civilization if we chose to. 20 times over, we maintained the capability to render our own world uninhabitable. We came within minutes of executing that option on multiple occasions, not due to malice, but due to miscommunication, equipment failure, and the general volatility of a species that had decided mutual annihilation was a strategically rational deterrent. That is... Vex searched for the word. That is clinically insane. Yes, Elena said simply without defensiveness. We are extraordinarily good at insane when we feel cornered. We have a formal military doctrine for it. Actually, we call it total war. She said the phrase the way someone might describe a law of physics. Not with pride, not with shame, but with the casual certainty of deep familiarity. Total war means that the entire machinery of a civilization, every factory, every resource deposit, every citizen of working age, every intellectual capacity, every cultural institution, is restructured overnight toward a single unified objective, the complete and unconditional destruction of the enemy, not their army, not their leadership, everything, their infrastructure, their economy, their supply lines, their civilian will to continue. We don't defeat opponents when we truly commit to conflict, Ambassador Vex. We erase them. She stopped moving. The room felt smaller than it had when he'd walked in. And here's the part one need you to hear most clearly, she said, her voice dropping just slightly, gaining an edge that cut through the air like something physical. We did all of that to ourselves, to people who looked exactly like us, people who shared 99.9% of our genetic code, people whose languages we could learn, whose children we could recognize, whose pain we could understand because we felt the same pain. She held his gaze across the table, and for the first time since entering the room, Vex Thornax found that he did not want to hold hers. I would like you to think very carefully, she said softly, about what we are capable of doing to a species we have no biological connection to whatsoever. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Vex had ever heard. Fight or flight signals were firing along neural pathways he hadn't used since his juvenile arena trials. Pathways he had assumed, with professional confidence, were vestigial. His secondary heart had accelerated. His claws were pressing involuntarily against the floor. Every combat instinct in his body was converging on the same conclusion, presenting it to his consciousness with the urgency of an emergency broadcast. This is a threat. This is a real threat. Respond accordingly. He was the one being threatened. Him, Vex Thornax. By a human. Elena moved toward a storage locker built into the conference room wall, a detail he had cataloged on entry and immediately dismissed as irrelevant, and opened it with a soft mechanical hiss. Her hands disappeared inside. When they emerged, they were cradling something with a reverence that stopped the breath in Vex's chest. It was a weapon, unmistakably a weapon, even to an eye unfamiliar with its specific design. The lean elegance of its proportions, the dark polished sheath that enclosed a length of approximately 1 meter, the intricate cord wrapping on what was clearly a handle. Ancient, not in the sense of being worn or damaged. Every surface showed meticulous care, but in its fundamental design philosophy, this was a weapon built for a body holding at close range, for violence that looked you in the face. She carried it to the table and laid it across both palms, horizontal, the way you might offer something sacred. "This," she said, "is a katana, a sword. It was forged on Earth in the year 1867 by a master craftsman named Takeshi Yamamoto, who spent weeks on its construction, folding the steel 10,000 times, shaping the edge through a process of grinding and polishing that required months of patient, obsessive labor." She looked at it as she spoke. "It has been in my family for 258 years. Vex stared at it, then at her, then back at the blade. "You brought a pre-industrial melee weapon to a diplomatic negotiation," he said. He heard his own voice come out half an octave higher than intended and resented it. "Is this ceremonial? Or does your civilization genuinely still not have ranged weapons? Because I can recommend several manufacturers if the budget is." "My ancestor Kenji Torres carried this sword during a period of Japanese history called the Meiji Restoration," Elena said, the interruption so smooth and unhurried that it barely registered as one. "He was a samurai." "I neither know nor particularly." "Samurai were warriors," she continued, and there was something in her voice now that suggested the history lesson was going to conclude on its own schedule regardless of his preferences. But the word contains much more than military function. They lived by a code called Bushido, the way of the warrior. It governed every aspect of their existence. How they fought and how they died, certainly, but also how they spoke, how they treated their obligations, how they understood honor, loyalty, and duty. They began training in childhood and continued until death. They were not soldiers in the conventional sense. They were a philosophy of violence given human form. She ran her fingers along the sheath, not quite touching it, hovering a centimeter above the surface, as though even that required permission. This blade was Kenji's soul made physical. He carried it through 7 major engagements. He survived injuries that should have killed him on 3 separate occasions. And when the age of the samurai ended, when Japan modernized and warriors in his mold were no longer needed or wanted, he kept this sword. He cleaned it and oiled it and wrapped its handle in fresh cord, and he passed it to his son. She looked up from the weapon. His son passed it to his daughter. His daughter passed it to her son. And it traveled through the generations of my family, across centuries and eventually across the stars, until it came to me. Vex found himself unable to produce the dismissive response he was reaching for. "My great-grandfather Marcus Torres carried this blade during the Third Martian Rebellion," Elena continued, and now she lifted the weapon slightly, not drawing it, simply holding it, and the grip had changed, he noticed. More secure, more informed. He never once drew it in combat, but every soldier who served under him knew it was there. They knew what it meant, not the specific history. Simply this: here is a man who comes from people who understood violence at its roots, who studied it the way scholars study philosophy, not because they loved it, but because they respected it enough not to be careless with it. She set it back down on the table between them. "My grandfather, Chun Torres, kept it on his command desk during the Titan blockade. 47 days under siege. No supply lines, no reinforcement, communications cut to static. Every morning, a transmission from besieging force demanding surrender. Every morning, Chun Torres sat at his desk with his blade laid in front of him, and he refused. He said afterward that the sword was his anchor, not a war trophy or a prop, but a reminder. The people in his bloodline had faced worse than this and had not yielded. Therefore, yielding was simply not available to him as an option." She paused. On day 48, the relief fleet broke through the blockade line. Vex had leaned back in his chair at some point during the story. He hadn't decided to do it. His body had simply made the determination that a few additional centimeters of distance were appropriate. "My mother, Admiral Sophia Torres, wore this blade on her hip during 6 months of negotiations at the Proxima Accords," Elena said. "She never touched it during those negotiations. She didn't need to. It simply existed, visible, familiar, quietly present at every table, every meeting, every late-night session of exhausted diplomats trying to find language that wouldn't collapse. It was a reminder to everyone in that room that when humans sat down to negotiate, they were doing so from a position of informed choice. We understand war. We understand it with a depth that most species don't. We choose alternatives to it not because we lack the capacity for it, but because we possess enough capacity to make the choice meaningful. She looked directly at him. You see the distinction I'm drawing? Vex said nothing. His mouth was not cooperating. The craft were born of conflict, Elena said, and her tone was not cruel. If anything, it was almost gentle, the tone of someone explaining a complex truth to someone who deserves to understand it. It is written into your genetics, your culture, your entire social architecture. Combat is your natural state. Peace, for your species, is the exception, the conscious effort against instinct. For you, war is easy. You don't have to choose it. It chooses you. She picked up the sword again, still sheathed, and held it loosely at her side. Humans are the opposite. Our default state is community, connection. We build, we create, we explore because curiosity is as hardwired into us as aggression. We make art and music and literature. We develop philosophy and mathematics and medicine. We negotiate because we genuinely prefer the outcome of resolution to the outcome of destruction. Her voice was even and clear. But every human generation must learn war from scratch, Ambassador. We are not born with your advantages. We have no claws, no armored plating, no biological weaponry. We have to craft our tools of violence, study them, master them, adapt them. And because we have always been physically outmatched by the things that threaten us, on our own world long before we reach yours, we had to become extraordinarily, methodically, frighteningly good at violence to survive. She set the sheath on the table. Her hands moved to the handle. I keep this sword, she said quietly, and millions of humans across the colonies keep weapons like it. Swords, spears, bows, axes, instruments from a past we do not glorify but absolutely refuse to forget, because we never want to lose sight of what we are capable of. We never want the comfort of peace to make us careless about the price of peace. Beneath the diplomacy and the signed agreements and the carefully worded communiques, we are a species that clawed our way to the top of a vicious food chain by being the most efficient, most adaptable, most persistent killers our world had ever produced. Her fingers settled on the grip, and we made a choice, a conscious, deliberate, every single generation choice to be better than that, to lead with our minds rather than our hands, to negotiate rather than conquer. She looked at him steadily. That choice is one of the greatest things our species has ever accomplished, but it would mean nothing, if we had forgotten how to make the other choice. Would you like a demonstration, Ambassador Vex? He didn't answer. He didn't have time. Elena Torres drew the katana. The sound it produced as the blade cleared the sheath, that specific metallic whisper note of perfectly honed steel against polished wood, traveled through Vex's nervous system, not as sound but as signal. Pure biological alarm, older than language, older than civilization, older than the concept of diplomacy itself. Edge thing, close range, high velocity, danger. He threw himself backward. The chair went over with a crash that resounded through the entire room. Vex hit the floor on all fours, scrambling instinctively away from the blade, all four eyes wide, every survival mechanism simultaneously overriding his dignity and screaming with one voice. Elena hadn't moved toward him. She stood exactly where she had been, the blade held low, point angled toward the floor, her breathing unhurried. She wasn't even looking at him directly, and somehow, that was more terrifying than aggression would have been. She wasn't threatening him. She simply existed with the weapon in her hand, and every neuron in his body was responding to that existence, as though it were an imminent execution. Lights, observation mode, she said calmly, addressing the room. The wall panels along the conference room's perimeter shifted, and what Vex had cataloged as standard acoustic paneling revealed itself as one-way transparency. A gallery opened on the other side. At least 12 observers were seated there, representatives of nearly every significant diplomatic power in the sector. He recognized the Selkath ambassador immediately. Impossible to miss the prismatic scatter of light through that crystalline exoskeleton. 2 Vin delegates, their long appendages curled tight against their torsos in a defensive configuration. A granite folk observer whose expression somehow conveyed absolute, riveted attention despite being architecturally incapable of expression. They had been there the entire time. Every word, every moment of his boasting. Every claim about soft mammals and prey species, and the galaxy's newest members. Every syllable of his contempt, observed and recorded. And now they had witnessed the galaxy's greatest warrior ambassador scramble across a conference room floor on his hands and knees, fleeing a human with a sword. Combat training dummy. Standard configuration. Elena called out. A panel in the floor opened smoothly. The dummy that rose from it was military-grade polymer composite. Vex recognized the material immediately. He had reviewed weapon specifications that morning. That polymer required industrial cutting lasers to shape and manufacturing. Standard plasma rifles needed multiple hits to breach it. It was a material they used to test weapons before certifying them for combat use. Elena walked toward it. Her movement had changed completely from anything she'd shown before. Each step precisely placed, weight flowing forward with a controlled economy of someone for whom every motion was a result of thousands of hours of training. Her center of gravity had dropped. Her shoulders were settled. Both hands moved to the handle, grip settling with the quiet certainty of deep muscle memory. She stopped 3 meters from the target. Then she moved. Vex had watched craft blade masters train. He had observed Grin shock troops in live combat situations. He had reviewed recordings of Hive warrior engagements where individual fighters moved faster than most species' visual systems could track. He had believed, with professional confidence, that he had a comprehensive understanding of what close-quarters combat capability could look like at its ceiling. He had been wrong. The distance to the dummy vanished. He didn't see her cover it. One moment she was 3 meters away, and the next she was already past the target, blade extended in a follow-through position, and the room was silent. Completely silent, as though the violence had occurred faster than sound could record it. Then the dummy separated. A diagonal cut from upper shoulder to opposite hip. So clean the exposed polymer surface caught the overhead lights like polished glass. Both halves hit the floor at the same moment. Someone in the observation gallery made a sound, soft, almost reverent. Elena hadn't paused. She turned, stepped, and the blade described 3 arcs in rapid succession, a sequence so fast Vex's 4 eyes, which could track movement in near darkness, couldn't resolve the individual strikes. They arrived as a pattern of light, silver and cold. She pivoted on one heel, drove a final cut horizontally through the air with a sound like drawn breath, and stepped back. Nothing happened for a moment. Then the upper portion of the dummy, the section already severed from its base, collapsed into 6 equal pieces. She had cut it multiple times while it was falling, while it was in midair, and she had done it with precision that suggested not improvisation but deep, integrated knowledge of exactly how things fall when they're cut. The observation gallery was completely silent. Even the Vin had stopped moving. Elena raised the blade and examined it in the overhead light. Not a chip, not a smudge, not a single sign of stress along the edge. Then, with a motion as unhurried as the draw had been, she sheathed it. The sound, soft, conclusive, a period at the end of the sentence, was somehow the loudest thing in the room. That blade, she said, her breathing elevated only slightly, was forged using techniques developed over 1,000 years of continuous refinement. The steel was folded 10,000 times to eliminate impurities and create a grained structure that supports both flexibility and edge retention. The sharpening process alone requires weeks of graduated work, and my family has maintained it for 7 generations. She turned to where Vex crouched against the far wall. Now then, Ambassador Vex Thornax. Her voice carried across the silence with absolute clarity. Would you like to continue threatening the human colony on Kepler 7, or shall we discuss what a fair and mutually beneficial agreement might look like? It took Vex 3 attempts to stand up. His legs, which had carried him through 17 planetary invasions, which had not trembled since his juvenile arena trials, kept undermining him. He gripped the overturned chair for support, righted it mechanically, and lowered himself into it with what remained of his dignity. He kept 5 full meters between himself and Elena Torres. The sheathed blade sat on the table between them, like a quiet detonation, waiting for a sufficient trigger. I believe, he said, and had to stop and clear his throat, that I may have approached this conversation with some significant analytical errors. You think? Elena asked, and there was genuine amusement in it, not mockery, but a particular kind of tired, earned humor that belongs to people who have been in this exact situation before and already know how it resolves. She gestured toward his chair. Sit down. Let's begin again. She set the sword between them on the table, horizontal, the way she'd first presented it, and Vex found himself unable to stop looking at it. Even sheathed, even perfectly still, the thing commanded attention the way a loaded weapon always did, not through aggression but through possibility. You're wondering, Elena said, settling into her own chair with composure that seemed, if anything, even more settled than it had when he'd first walked in, how you got this so completely wrong. Yes, he said. There was no point in pretending otherwise. It's a common mistake, she said, and there was no cruelty in the observation. Most species encounter humans for the first time and see exactly what you saw. Physically unimpressive by galactic standards. No biological weapons, no natural armor. Environmental parameters far too narrow for independent survival in most settings. By the metrics that most military species use to assess threat levels, we shouldn't register as a serious concern. We understand why the assessment keeps coming out that way. And yet, she confirmed. But the error isn't the data. The error is in what you assume the data means. She leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the table. The craft are warriors by nature. Combat is your first language. It's written into your biology, your culture, your child-rearing practices. You don't choose war. War is your gravitational center, and everything else orbits it. That is not a weakness. It's a genuine, formidable strength. She paused. Humans are different. Our center of gravity is cooperation, community. We are deeply, fundamentally social creatures who build better in groups than alone, and who instinctively seek connection rather than dominance. Our first language is collaboration. Peace for us is not the exception. It's the preference every single time. She glanced at the sword. But every generation of human beings inherits the full history of what we've done when that preference was denied to us. We teach it to our children, not to glorify it, not to make them proud of the killing, but to ensure they understand the stakes of the choice they're making when they choose peace, so that it remains a real choice, made with open eyes, not a comfortable illusion maintained through ignorance. She looked back at him. Every human who keeps a weapon like this one is making a statement to themselves and to anyone paying attention. I know what I come from. I know what I'm capable of. And today, I am choosing to be something better. Vex was quiet for a long time. The 3,000 people on Kepler 7, he said finally, have families, Elena said simply. Have children learning their letters in classrooms built with their parents' hands. Have elderly people growing food in gardens they designed themselves. They chose to be colonists, builders, farmers. None of them chose to be soldiers. Her expression was direct and clear. But if you made that choice for them, if you forced it on them, then every single one of them will become exactly what I described to you today, with cold calculation and absolute commitment, and no concept whatsoever of an acceptable outcome that includes surrender. She shrugged very slightly. We have a saying, you can take the human out of the war. You cannot take the war out of the human. Vex sat with that for a moment in the observation gallery. Through the now transparent walls, he could see the Selkith ambassador's communication interface active, crystalline fingers moving rapidly across the transmission panel. Within hours, perhaps less, every word of this conversation would be in circulation to the Galactic Council's diplomatic channels. The account of Ambassador Vex Thornax, pride of the craft Dominion, reduced to scrambling across a conference room floor by a human with an antique sword, would travel at the speed of information across every civilized system. His career, if he was being precise about it, was almost certainly finished. He found, to his genuine surprise, that this did not feel like the most important thing in the room. The craft Dominion, he said, slowly and clearly, ensure his translator captured every inflection, will formally withdraw our territorial claim to the Kepler 7 system. We will recognize United Earth Coalition sovereignty over the planet and its resources. We will negotiate a fair value trade agreement for access to beryllium deposits on mutually acceptable terms. Standard diplomatic framework, equal representation, binding arbitration, full council oversight. That's a reasonable starting point, Elena said, and the tension in her shoulders released, barely perceptibly, But Vex's 4 eyes caught it. Something that had been held in careful check throughout the entire encounter was allowed, finally, to ease. We'd welcome trade with the craft. Our position has always been that there's more long-term value in cooperation than in conquest. Yes, Vex agreed quickly. Cooperation. Absolutely. Significantly preferable to the alternative. She smiled then, fully, warmly, the genuine smile of someone who had arrived at exactly the outcome they'd been working toward without having to hurt anyone to get there. It was, Vex reflected, one of the most frightening things he had seen all day. The renegotiation ran for hours. For hours of Vex agreeing to nearly every term Elena proposed, because every time some fragment of reflexive negotiating instinct rose up to object to a clause or push back on a percentage point, his gaze would drift involuntarily to the sword laid on the table between them, and the objection would simply dissolve before it reached his mouth. By the time the final terms were drafted, they had established equitable trade routes with revenue sharing on beryllium extraction, cultural exchange programs that would have seemed laughable to him 6 hours ago, joint infrastructure investment in Kepler-7's continued development, and the detail that would most thoroughly humiliate him when the full record was eventually published, a mutual security agreement wherein the craft Dominion pledged partial military resources toward the protection of several human colonial systems. The craft Dominion, protecting a human colony it had threatened to remove by force that same morning. The other delegates filtered into the room as the formal signing process concluded. Every single one of them regarded Elena Torres differently now, not with the cautious political respect typically extended to representatives of emerging civilizations, but with something older and more elemental than political calculation. The VIN delegates maintained a respectful buffer space, their appendages held close against their bodies in a posture that Vex practiced I recognized as instinctive rather than chosen. The Silkoff bowed, a deep, formal inclination that he had never, in 30 years of diplomatic service, witnessed him offer to any non-Silkoff representative. The granite folk observer approached Elena with the careful gravity of someone approaching something they intend to remember for a very long time. Captain Torres, the granite folk said, its voice like tectonic plates finding accommodation after long resistance. Your presentation today was clarifying. The Granite Collective would like to initiate formal diplomatic relations with the United Earth Coalition at your earliest available convenience. We'd be honored, Elena replied, with the gracious ease of someone for whom this was simply the next logical step. Vex watched the scene unfold and recognized it for what it was, a turning point, not just in his career or in the specific diplomatic trajectory of human-craft relations, but in how the broader galactic community would understand humanity going forward. In 4 hours, Elena Torres had accomplished what years of human diplomatic effort had apparently been unable to achieve, not through argument or political maneuvering, but by ensuring that every observing species in the sector now possessed a clear and unambiguous picture of what they would be facing if they chose to underestimate the wrong mammal. And he had been the instrument of that lesson. The other delegates dispersed into smaller conversations, and Elena returned to the storage locker, lifting the sword with the same care and reverence she had shown throughout. Vex watched her secure inside and closed the panel. Captain Torres, he said quietly. She turned. If I may ask you something. Of course, Ambassador. If I had not backed down. He needed a moment to push past the professional reluctance. If the craft had moved forward. If I had followed through on every threat I made when I walked in here, what would have happened? Elena was still for a moment. When she answered, her voice was honest in a way that he had not expected. Not triumphant, not calculated, just truthful. I genuinely don't know, she said. The craft have substantial advantages in nearly every quantifiable military category. Superior numbers, more advanced weapons platforms, more cumulative combat experience. On paper, a craft military campaign against Kepler-7 should succeed. She turned to face him fully. But humans don't fight on paper. We fight with everything we have, every resource we can reach, every person willing to stand in a line. We don't have a strategic concept of an acceptable level of loss, because we don't accept a framework of acceptable loss. We have a phrase, no surrender, no retreat. It is not a slogan. It is a description of how we actually behave when we have no other option. Total war, Vex said. Total war, she confirmed. You might have taken Kepler 7, but what would it have cost you? How many ships? How many soldiers? How many months or years of grinding campaign against an enemy that considers mutual destruction a perfectly acceptable outcome? And after Kepler 7, what? We have other colonies. We have allies now. She gestured toward the emptying observation gallery. We have a home world with a population that has been conditioning itself for exactly this kind of conflict for its entire recorded history. How long would the craft Dominion want to sustain a war against a species that doesn't know how to stop? The cold that moved through Vex had nothing to do with the climate control. She was right. It was a simple strategic calculation, and he had been too arrogant to run it. Even a successful craft campaign against humanity would be ruinously costly. Financially, militarily, politically. Defeating them would require a commitment of resources that would leave the Dominion vulnerable to every other rival civilization, watching for an opening, and that assumed the campaign ended, which it wouldn't. Not against them. Not given what she described. He had been preparing to win a battle. He had not stopped to calculate the war. I need to send a message to the Dominion, he said, half to himself. What will you tell them? Elena asked. He considered it carefully. That humans are not prey, he said. That they are not a soft target or an opportunity for territorial expansion. That they are a species which has spent thousands of years developing a relationship with violence so sophisticated, so deeply integrated into their cultural memory, that the only reason we don't perceive it is because they choose not to show it to us, and that choice is the most dangerous thing about them. He paused. I will tell them that if you ever encounter a human in a negotiation, and they remain calm while you threaten them, you should be afraid. Not because calm indicates weakness, because calm in a human indicates control, and a species that has what they have under control, and is still choosing control. That is not a species you want to give a reason to stop choosing it. Elena looked at him for a long moment. You learn quickly, Ambassador Vex. I had an exceptionally compelling instructor, he said, and meant it without irony. She extended her hand across the table. The same hand she'd offered at the beginning. The same ritual he'd dismissed with contempt an eternity ago in what felt like a different version of the same room. This time, he took it. Her grip was firm, unhurried, precise. The handshake of someone who had absolutely nothing left to demonstrate. I look forward to a long and productive relationship between our peoples, she said formally. As do I, Captain Torres, he replied. As do I. He composed a message as he walked through the station corridors toward his ship, the words organizing themselves with a clarity that tends to emerge in the aftermath of a very thorough lesson. To all Craft Dominion commanders, from Ambassador Vex Thornax, priority advisory regarding United Earth Coalition. I have met humans. I have assessed them. I have made every error of judgment available to me regarding them, and I survived those errors only because one human decided, for her own reasons, that today was a day for education rather than confrontation. Do not mistake their physical construction for fragility. Do not mistake their preference for diplomacy for inability to fight. Do not confuse their patience with passivity or their stillness with fear. They carry ancient weapons, swords and spears and blades from a past they don't glamorize but refuse to bury, because they understand that memory is a weapon too. They teach their children the full record of what they have done when pushed beyond the point of choice, not to produce soldiers, but to ensure that every generation understands exactly what they are choosing when they choose peace. They choose it every day, deliberately, with full knowledge of the alternative. The craft fight because it is what we are. Humans fight because they decide to. And the ones who fight from decision rather than instinct, the ones who reach for those carefully maintained blades after choosing peace 1,000 times before, they fight with something we don't have a word for in our language. I watched a human woman cut a military-grade polymer training dummy into pieces with a 1,000-year-old sword. I watched every diplomatic representative in a secured gallery hold their breath. I watched species who have ruled sectors of this galaxy for centuries treat a human being with the respect usually reserved for something much older and much larger than she appeared. Do not mistake what they appear to be for what they are. I learned that lesson today, In a conference room, I walked into with contempt and left with comprehension. I survived the learning. I cannot guarantee you will be equally fortunate. Filed as formal recommendation. Avoid military confrontation with the United Earth Coalition at all costs. Pursue diplomatic and trade relationships wherever possible. Remember always that the hand they extend to you, that small, strange, weaponless human hand, belongs to a species that has never fully forgotten how to be something else, and that they know it, and that they want you to know they know it. That is what makes them dangerous. That is what makes them worth knowing. Vex Thornax, Ambassador, Craft Dominion. He sent it before he reached the docking bay. He didn't know what would come of it. He didn't know how the Dominion's high command would receive the admission that their most decorated living ambassador had been genuinely frightened by a human holding a sword in a conference room. He didn't know whether his career would recover, or whether the recordings from the observation gallery would define his legacy in ways he hadn't chosen. But he found, walking through the recycled air of the station toward the cold geometry of space waiting beyond its hull, that he was grateful. Not for the humiliation, that would take considerably longer process, but for what it had given him. He had walked into that room knowing everything about warfare and nothing about humanity. He was leaving knowing something more important, that across the stars, among all the species sharpening their claws and calculating their conquests, there was one small, soft, two-eyed civilization that had looked into the deepest part of what it was and chosen, deliberately and repeatedly and at great cost to its pride, to reach for something better, and that it kept a sword nearby, just to make sure the choice remained real. This has been a Hybrid Shadows original story. If this moves something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The conference room smelled like recycled air and bureaucratic anxiety. That particular blend of filtered oxygen and quiet desperation that every diplomatic station in the known galaxy seemed to manufacture in bulk. Ambassador Vex Thornax didn't notice. He was too busy admiring his own reflection in the polished durasteel doors as they hissed open before him. He strutted inside like he owned not just a room, but the entire star system surrounding it. To be fair, given the Craft Dominion's current territorial reach, that wasn't entirely an exaggeration. His scales caught the harsh overhead lighting beautifully, each one polished to a mirror sheen that morning by his personal attendants, burnished until they gleamed like hammered obsidian kissed by starlight. At 2.8 meters tall, with four amber eyes that could track movement in near-total darkness and claws serrated along their inner edges like molecular blades, Vex Thornax was what his species had spent 10,000 generations becoming, a perfect instrument of war wrapped in the elegant clothing of diplomacy. The doors sealed behind him with a satisfying, pressurized hiss. Easy, he thought. This is going to be embarrassingly easy. The Craft Dominion had dispatched him specifically because situations like these required a particular kind of intelligence, not the bookish, archive-diving kind, but the sharp, instinctive intelligence of someone who understood that most political problems were really just military problems wearing a disguise. Some upstart human colony had planted their roots on Kepler 7, a planet the Dominion had flagged for annexation 3 cycles ago. The beryllium deposits beneath its crust were worth more than the gross economic output of a dozen developing civilizations. The humans needed to understand that they had made a mistake. They needed to pack their belongings, gather their fragile little families, and evacuate with whatever dignity remained to them. Vex was here to make that message clear. He had, in his distinguished career, negotiated with the Vin Collective, tentacled nightmares from the Outer Rim, whose casual grip could buckle starship hulls like tissue paper. He had stared down the hive queens of Sector 9, creatures whose pheromone clouds alone could send most species sprinting for the nearest airlock in blind panic. He had brought war-hungry warlords to the table and left them signing treaties they didn't want to sign, because that was what Vex Thornax did. Humans, though? Humans were the galaxy's newest arrival, barely 2 centuries out from their homeworld, still drunk on the novelty of faster-than-light travel, still marveling at the fact that the universe was larger than their imagination had allowed. They were soft mammals who had stumbled into the stars and mistaken good fortune for greatness. He scanned the room with practiced, dismissive efficiency. Standard diplomatic configuration. Long table, too many chairs, walls designed to absorb sound and anxiety in equal measure. Mutual ground, they called it He called a room full of furniture that hadn't earned its place in the galaxy yet. Then he saw her. His first thought, and he would not be ashamed of this, because it was an entirely reasonable observation given the available evidence, was that someone had sent a child to meet him. She was seated at the far end of the table, and she was tiny, perhaps 1.6 meters at a generous estimate. Her frame looked like something a moderate gust of recycled station air could topple. No scales, no natural armor plating, no visible biological weaponry of any kind. Just pale skin over what appeared to be a distressingly fragile skeletal structure. Dark hair pulled back in a clean, functional arrangement in two hands. Two small hands, folded with quiet composure on the table before her. She wore a uniform, deep navy blue with insignia patches stitched onto the shoulders and chest. Military rank markers, probably the kind of thing that meant something to humans. She looked like she weighed less than his left arm. She stood as he approached, extending one of those impossibly small hands toward him across the table. "Captain Elena Torres," she said. Her voice was clear, unhurried, carrying none of the deference that Vex had come to expect as is due from lesser species. "United Earth Coalition Colonial Defense Corps. Thank you for meeting with me today, Ambassador Vex." He stared at the offered hand for a long moment. He had read about this custom in his briefing files, the human handshake, a pre-spaceflight greeting ritual, originally designed to demonstrate that neither party was concealing a weapon in their palm. The fact that they had carried this ritual all the way into the stars, preserving it like some kind of quaint evolutionary artifact, told him everything he needed to know about the species. They were sentimental. Sentimental creatures made poor negotiators. He ignored the hand completely, moving past it to settle his considerable bulk into the reinforced chair across from her. The chair creaked under the impact, a deep, structural groan of protest that echoed satisfyingly through the room. Let her hear exactly what a real warrior sounded like when they simply sat down. "Let's dispense with pleasantries," he said, letting his translator carry the full resonant weight of his contempt. His voice filled the room the way thunder fills a canyon. Deep, reverberant, designed by 10,000 years of evolutionary pressure to make prey species survival instincts scream. "You are currently occupying Kepler 7. That planet falls within Craft Dominion territorial jurisdiction. You have 30 standard days to evacuate your colony. Failure to comply will result in forcible removal. The choice is yours, but I would encourage you to choose wisely." Elena Torres lowered her unshaken hand with the same unhurried calm with which she had raised it. She sat back down. Her dark eyes, just two eyes, he noticed again, still unable to fathom how humans navigated a three-dimensional universe with such limited visual coverage, settled on him without flinching. "Ambassador," she said, her voice carrying the specific flavor of calm that belongs to people who have heard threats so often they started categorizing them. Kepler 7 was unclaimed space when our expedition arrived 4 years ago. Since then, our people have built infrastructure, established agricultural systems, and created homes. 3,000 human beings live on that planet. They have children enrolled in schools. They have elderly parents tending gardens. They have futures planted in that soil. She paused just briefly. "We are not leaving." Vex laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, unperformed, the kind that erupts when something is simply too absurd to contain. The sound bounced off every hard surface in the room, harsh and grinding, like boulders tumbling down a metal shaft. "Not leaving," he repeated, still chuckling, shaking his great head slowly. "Oh, that is magnificent. That is genuinely the most entertaining thing said to me in 3 diplomatic cycles." He leaned forward, planting one massive forearm on the table, letting the overhead light play across the serrated edge of his claws. "Did your superiors actually authorize you to say that, or did you improvise?" Elena didn't react, not even slightly.